Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Katherine.Kelly, and I want to bring you a message about boundaries. The word boundary probably really didn't become popular until about 30 years ago, maybe 35 years ago, when people started talking more about codependency and talking about how to set those boundaries, be assertive. And so there's this evolution that is happening about boundaries. And pretty much every day in my psychotherapy practice, I end up talking to clients who are struggling with boundaries, whether they're very codependent with their children, with their spouse, with people at work. In other words, giving in too much, giving too much of yourself, saying yes when you really need to set a boundary of no for taking care of yourself in terms of exhaustion, or that you're trying to be nice and you try to give, or you're afraid to hurt someone's feelings. And I want to talk a little bit about what that does to your soul when you give in too much. Because the essence of who we are, our soul, only has so much to give. And yet, what do? Oftentimes we overgive for the sake of being liked, for the sake of being pleased, for the sake of not losing someone in our lives, or for the sake of really feeling loved at all. Because I think a lot of people mistake what love is because they think they're supposed to give. Now, the challenge with all of that, of course, is the fact that when we give too much, then, we feel depleted ourselves. So that sense of remorse, that sense of regret that happens after we give too much usually leads to negative behavior. So I have many clients who are emotional eaters, and I try to help them identify what it is that is triggering them. And more often than not, they have given too much. They have given too much of themselves in one way or another. And so what ends up happening is they feel that sense of remorse, they're beating up on themselves, or they're up with food. So that's one example. Another example is when, again, you feel like you are really giving too much in terms of work. You work, and then you go home, and then you've got people at home that are tugging and pulling at you. I had someone yesterday in the office who she came home from work. She's a medical practitioner, and she had a very full day. She came home from work. She was very depleted. And she kind of sat down with her coat on and was just staring. And one of the things that happened was she realized that the second she sat down, everybody in her household was saying, "Hey, when's dinner? Or what are you going to make? Or hey, can you help me with this? Or can you do that?" And these are all adults in her household, and yet she felt so compelled to feel like she needed to help these people. She didn't have the boundaries to say no. She felt like, to be a good mother or a good wife, she had to, or a good daughter in that matter. She has a daughter that lives, or a mother that lives with her as well. So it's a matter of how do you know when to set that boundary? How do you know when to say no? You know when to take care of your own soul. And the number one answer to that is when you feel the least bit of frustration or regret or remorse. If you were to say yes, or if you were to go in there, that's your cue. If you know you're going to feel drained, if you know that you're going to have a bad behavioral reaction afterward, then that's when you need to start listening to that cue from the soul to say, no, I cannot do that. I need to learn how to take care of myself. Now, the challenge in our day is that, we have this idea that giving and taking care of everybody else is still the best thing. We are taught that from a very young age. Many religions teach that, you have to give to others before you give to yourself. I agree to that, with that when a person is so depleted, they're unhealthy themselves, then basically, that's what your soul's trying to tell you, is that your soul's trying to say, I am so exhausted, do not give more. So how do we start reconciling this? Because we've been taught we're supposed to be nice. We're taught we're supposed to be giving at all times. It's just an interesting concept. But as a psychologist who does soul work, I see every day what the negative impact of giving too much or not having good boundaries does. I watch it. It ends up with emotional eating. It ends up with spending way too much money, or spending way too much time watching TV because you're so exhausted you can't go do anything else that's good for you. I see it in terms of feeling very depleted and not happy within relationships. I see it in so many different ways because people don't feel like they can set those boundaries. So what happens to your soul is that it starts to get shrivelly. It starts to shrivel up. You don't have a lot to give. And as humans, we react in lots of different ways. We either fall into that sense of being shriveled and we kind of lose any personal power, or we become very angry and resentful, or both. And so one of the things we have to start doing is learning how to, number one, learning what a boundary is, and number two, learning how to set it so that we can protect who we are, what we need for ourselves. Now, this is something I teach people all the time, and it gets very uncomfortable for people, because the whole reason people give too much is that they're afraid to hurt someone else's feelings, or they don't want the other person to be uncomfortable or to be stressed out or whatever that might be. But I try to emphasize that when we do something that helps us align with our soul, in my book I talk about alignment and how to align your tree of life so that you are feeling radiant and healthy. So when we do something that helps us align our lives, yes, it may make other people uncomfortable, but you have to get it through yourself that when you make someone else uncomfortable, it is actually a cue for them to be uncomfortable enough to change something else. So in other words, you're giving them the gift of discomfort so that they can learn how to take care of themselves. So I'm going to say that again, because when we do something to align ourselves, in some ways we are meant to make other people uncomfortable so they can evolve as well. So I want you to really think about that when we take care of ourselves, we are actually encouraging other people to take care of themselves as well. And if you look around, there is a whole country, a whole world, 7.5 billion people who really don't know how to take care of themselves. So we have to remember that when we don't set good boundaries, we are hurting more than our human side of us. We are deeply hurting that sense of self. We are deeply, I use the word offending our souls when we don't do something that's good for us. And that's where regret comes from. That's where resentment comes from. That's where exhaustion comes from. That's where all of those negative experiences of the human condition come from. And so it's a tricky business because, yes, there are some people we have to take care of, or there's some animals we have to take care of. But at the same time, we have to set the boundaries. We have to learn, where is my line? Where is it that I need to draw that line so that I can maintain and sustain and fulfill my own soul's needs and evolution so that I can move forward. This is tricky, tricky business because, again, in our world, we're taught a lot about, in a not so healthy way, we're taught a lot about giving, 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 which again is an honorable kind of thing to a point. Now, I've said this before, it shocks people when I say it, but Mother Teresa, who was known as the martyr, known as the person who gave everything she could, she's been sainted formally because of the fact that she gave so much. But if you read anything about her biography, she didn't put herself in the hospital. She ended up in the hospital many times because she was so exhausted and depleted. So she was on this mission for the sake of helping others, which again was great. But how many times did she almost die because of that? How many times did she give so much in her own soul as a very religious woman was so depleted that her body just bottomed out? So she wasn't the greatest example of what I would call soul health. She wasn't the greatest example of modeling for people how to take care of themselves. And so it makes me wonder, did these people ever learn to take care of themselves? I don't know. I wasn't there. But I think it's one of those things where we have to remember that by setting boundaries, we are actually teaching people how to be healthy. I'm going to say that again. When we set boundaries, we are teaching other people how to be healthy, because when we set that boundary, we give that other person the opportunity to empower themselves to go, oh wow, look what he or she is doing, and I need to go learn how to do that. So I want to just emphasize this, that poor boundaries are really probably one of the worst offenses to the soul. When we don't honor our own soul, when we don't listen and take care of our own soul, we are creating some very deep wounds, and we have to take responsibility for that. A lot of people like to victimize themselves, saying, oh, it's them, it's their fault, they want so much, they need so much. But you have to see what it is that you are doing to participate in that dynamic and learn what it takes to step back and go, wait a minute, that's their stuff, or wait a minute, I need to take care of me, and that will help them learn how to take care of them. So it's separating out who you are taking care of and getting yourself to the point where you realize that the best thing you can do for yourself and your own evolution, and in many ways for those around you, is to set those boundaries. So think about that. That's a tough one to really reconcile, because we've been taught the opposite, that when we give too much and we get depleted, then we are good for nobody, including ourselves. And then you have emotional eating, then you have drinking and drugging, then you have oversexing, or then you have sitting on the couch and feeling comatose because you can't do anything else, or then you can't give as a healthcare provider or whomever else, whatever other roles you play. So you have to really think of the negative impact your poor boundaries are creating on your own life and those around you. So just something to think about. And this is a very, again, tricky topic. Because we want to be nice, we want to be kind, we want to be loving, and yet there is a line. And I'm going to mention one more thing, because this is a topic I teach in a lot of workshops. There's a huge difference between being selfish, how do I say this? Selfish, selfless, or for self. And a lot of people think they're supposed to be selfless. And yet, if you really think about how miserable people are and how unhealthy they are when they're being selfless, it's not a good thing. That's where Mother Teresa was, but she was not a healthy individual. So you have to look at those differences. Selfish over here, you've got selfless over here. What I help people strive toward is what I call for self. You know when to give it, you know when to help, but you also know when you've got, that is not going to be good for my own soul. So lots of concepts, lots of things to think about, but these boundaries are major issues as far as our own soul's evolution. And I just felt, after listening to a couple of people the other day, well, this whole week, of how their boundaries have been so weak and so loose, I think it's just important for me to keep getting this message out from a human level of what it is doing to impact our souls when we have those poor boundaries. So think through that. I would love to hear what you have to say. I would love to hear what you've learned about your own boundaries, what you need to do in order to continue growing in that way. My newsletter, if you're not on my newsletter list, my newsletter will be coming out on Saturday. And I wrote an article about regret and self-love. So how those two are related. And it has a lot to do with that boundary setting. It has a lot to do with how we choose. But feel free to, if you're not on the newsletter list, go to my website, www.Dr.KatherineT.Kelly.com, and sign up, and then you'll get that as well, that newsletter. So hope you have a wonderful day, some food for thought. It's a really pretty day today since we've had so much rain, and I hope you all go out and enjoy it. Okay, take care.